Hi everyone, we're Group 1 and my group consists of Claudia, Edlyn, Joyce, Osman and myself, Natalie. We'll be analysing the ethical dilemma between TikTok and Amazon, given that they have both experienced exponential growth as tech companies in the past decade. Here's the table of contents. We'll be introducing the two companies followed by the three ethical dilemmas, namely technological and labor practices and CSR efforts. This will be followed by some recommendations and insights before concluding. Introducing the two companies, Amazon was founded in 1994 and is currently a leading multinational technology company which focuses on e-commerce, cloud computing, digital streaming, and artificial intelligence. The mission is to strive to offer customers the lowest price possible, the best available selection, and the utmost convenience. On the other hand, TikTok, a subsidiary of the parent company ByteDance, was founded in 2015 and operates a social media platform. They work towards their mission to inspire creativity and bring joy. Now, I'll be moving on to the technological practices of the two companies. Firstly, consumer data protection. For Amazon, they claim that they use encryption protocols and software to protect their consumers' data. However, Amazon has been issued heavy fines for breaching data protection. For the informal sources, Amazon is said to have its data protection system put together with tape and bubblegum, as well as carelessly left to outsiders. On the other hand, TikTok mentions if consumers are unhappy with the policies, they should not use the app. A Reddit user claims that TikTok is aware of their entire life outside of the app, while BuzzFeed evokes fear that China has access to US citizens' data through TikTok. Next is content regulation and recommendation algorithms. Amazon prides itself in having the best recommendation systems. However, this is countered by Review News, which claims that this is done at the expense of the company being vulnerable to internal threat actors. Likewise, TikTok aims for its algorithm to create long-term user, creator, and platform value. Wired also states that TikTok tries to mitigate the possibilities of filter bubbles by purposely showing users different views. To evaluate whether the sources align, for Amazon, there's a general alignment of the formal and informal sources as Amazon prioritizes their business and not their users. Likewise, the formal and informal sources of TikTok aligns as they are committed to creating user value.
For second ethical dimension, we have labor practices, but more specifically, working conditions. Starting from Amazon, we first take a look at its formal sources. New York Times said that Amazon's model for managing people was uneven and strained even before the coronavirus arrived, making heavy use of metrics, apps, and checkbots to scrutinize their workers. And when workers were told to take as much unpaid time off as they needed, they were hit with mandatory overtime. CNBC further perpetuates this as Sustainalytics, a Morningstar company that calculates ESG risk, said Amazon's ESG rating needs to improve in the social category, namely in terms of how it treats employees. While The Guardian reports unsafe, grueling conditions at warehouse, with high injury rates at 3 times the national average for warehouses, and multiple workers came forward with their stories of how they face immense pressures from being surveilled by computers to ensure productivity rates are met. For Amazon's informal sources, we have a thread from Reddit who claims that many employees get abused to the point that they have to take medical leave, and when that happens, Amazon will delay their pay in perpetuity by the length of time they are on medical leave. While posts on Glassdoor claims that there is no work-life balance given the overwhelming workload. As we can see from its formal sources, Amazon treats its employees badly and see them as mere means, regularly overworking them, while the informal sources revealed lack of work-life balance, overwhelming workload, delayed payment, and micromanagement beyond the norm. Therefore, there's a general alignment between the formal and informal sources that Amazon is not committed to its labor efforts and are not doing enough. On the other hand, we first take a look at TikTok's formal sources. In an article by Protocol, employees of US TikTok showed nothing but love for the company as they proclaimed loving where they work and confidence in the company and its leadership. While an article by CNBC said otherwise, as a former TikTok recruiter found himself working double shifts more often than not, and it was the norm for employees to restart their day and work during Chinese business hours to answer their ByteDance counterparts' questions. Another article by CNBC further supports this, claiming TikTok has a 996 culture and that everyone there is utterly miserable, with one of the employees counting only 4 or 5 weekends during the year of rest. For TikTok's informal sources, we have two different threads on Glassdoor, claiming no work-life balance, terrible schedule, bad management, and long hours since they need to communicate with their China counterpart. As you can see from formal sources, though US employees love their working conditions, there are more sources alluding to working overly long hours. Now the informal sources have no work-life balance on repeat. Thus, there's a general alignment between the formal and informal sources that TikTok is not committed to its labor efforts and are not doing enough.
The last ethical dimension our team will be focusing on is the comparison of CSR efforts. Our first quality formal source for Amazon is from its corporate website. It highlights the contributions Amazon has made for its employees, customers, and communities. Our next positive formal source is from Business Research Methodology, where it states how Amazon had participated in various CSR activities. One example is its packaging free program. Next, our negative formal source is from NBC News, where there was internal petition signed by employees due to the disproportionately higher amount of carbon emission in areas of communities of colours. This had resulted in poor quality of air and severe health issues. Moving on to the informal sources, our negative source is from BuzzFeed News, where it speaks about the growing concern on the environmental impact of Amazon Prime shipping services and deliveries. This had resulted in increased negative externalities. Lastly, our negative informal source is from Reddit, where it was shown that in contrast to its mission to building a sustainable business, there's still high packaging wastage, which is contradictory to its packaging-free program that aims to reduce wastage. Hence, as seen from our former sources, there's evidence of Amazon's greenwashing, though they did participate in CSR activities. Thus, upon evaluation of alignment between our sources, there's indeed a general alignment as Amazon is seen to not be committed to its CSR efforts and are insufficient. Moving on to TikTok, our first positive former source is from its corporate website, which speaks about how TikTok had leveraged on its global user base to create a community that advocates for climate change. This had achieved more than 20 billion views. Our next positive source is from Asia Pacific Journal of Management, which shows TikTok partnership with Alibaba to decrease poverty in rural areas. Our last positive source is from This Day Life that talks about TikTok's success in its TikTok Wildlife Day campaign to increase awareness on protection against wildlife crime. Now, for the informal sources, our first positive source is from Iconic MLL that shows how TikTok had inspired millions of youths to act on sustainable development through the Zero Waster Challenge. Our last positive source is from CSR Mandate that talks about how TikTok had got an international appeal to citizens to help save our oceans. Thus, based on our sources, we can conclude that there is a general alignment, as both shows how TikTok is committed to CSR efforts and are sufficient. Hence, to conclude who is more ethical based on our ethical dimensions, TikTok is seen as more ethical than Amazon.
For the first recommendation, the team recommends government intervention and regulation. The classical view can be applied to this recommendation as it supports the concept that the well-being of society should be the government's responsibility and businesses should just focus on their business objectives. The Kantian ethics of universality and humanity principles can also be applied to these recommendations on the internal regulations of the company. This is because companies should not abuse customers' data if they do not want others to do that to them. Also, organizations should not treat kids and their users as mere means for them to reach their business objectives. The next recommendation is to improve the working conditions of the employees. The ethical concept applicable to this recommendation is the French and Raven's basis of power, which is more apparent in the last recommendations for this ethical dimension. The team suggests that Amazon should have reviews and procedures and introduce a change agent which is appointed to oversee the changes regarding the micromanaging behaviors of the managers, and lastly to adopt referent and expert power to help increase the commitment of the staff or adopt legitimate and reward power for compliance to reduce resistance among the staff. The final recommendation for Amazon's CSR issue is to implement a standard measure and assessment which will help internally align the company's economic goals with better social contributions, which will eventually reduce its environmental harm. Ultimately, it will help to bridge the gap between its realities and grand plans. The anti-classical view is applicable to this recommendation as it supports the concept that corporations should act beyond the moral minimum to prevent social harm, in which active self-regulation like this recommendation is needed. Now for the insights with greater applications of the class concepts. By comparing the three ethical dimensions of both companies, the Adam Smith theory of justice and ethical egoism is applicable to both the technological practices and CSR efforts. As we have seen, Amazon has been seen prioritizing its growth over its environmental actions and how both companies are actually benefiting from the use of data to drive economic growth. Ethical egoism is therefore a common theory among these two dimensions, as it displays how one's actions are just if they just pursue self-interest which promotes the overall benefits of the whole economy. The classical view of CSR taxation on employees is also applicable, as it essentially also means that there's a diversion of money away from employees to use for public good. Next, the Aristotelian conceptions of justice is applicable to the labor practices dimensions, as the theory suggests that to be just, it means you are being lawful and fair. Compensatory justice is therefore the anchor of this ethical dimension, as it suggests that individuals should be compensated for the cost of their injuries. Overall, the saying of how it's better to do wrong than suffer wrong is apparent in this ethical dimension, as we see how Amazon uses its coercive power to make use of the storehouse workers, making Amazon feel that they have the natural right to rule over the weak and inferior.
We also identified the application of Kantian ethics to all three ethical dimensions. For the categorical imperatives aspect of Kantian ethics, there are two principles, namely the universality law and humanity principle. As said previously, we can see that Amazon uses greenwashing as a mere means to influence consumers into thinking that it is an ethical company to earn the trust of its consumers. In addition, by looking at the way Amazon and TikTok treat their employees, we believe that both companies wouldn't want to be treated back in such a way to be forced to perform beyond their working limits and to have their privacy invaded. To calculate the utility of both companies, we also adopted the cost-benefit analysis. Both Amazon and TikTok benefited from the misuse of consumers' private information to improve their applications to earn more profits, at the expense of violating an individual's right to privacy, which is a basic right guiding key ethical principles. Amazon also further benefited from its prime shipping to fuel consumerism to earn profits at the expense of increasing negative externalities. Hence, this proves the application of the cost-benefit analysis to quantify the utility of both companies in the two ethical dimensions. Next, under the concept of utilitarianism, we also identified the application of ad-utilitarianism and rule-utilitarianism to the same two ethical dimensions. We acknowledge that Amazon's prime delivery services benefited consumers through a fast, efficient, and convenient mode of transport, despite being at the expense of high wastage. Ultimately, the goal of the company is to ensure that it brings happiness and satisfaction to its consumers, which is for the greatest good for the greatest number. Similarly, we also acknowledge that the act of using consumers' data can benefit the greatest good for the greatest number, which is for both the consumers and the company. The consumers will be able to get a more customized experience while using the application, and the company will also be able to earn more profits at the same time. However, from the perspective after applying the rule utilitarianism, it is wrong of the company to misuse the consumer's data without their consent. Now, moving on to our last insight, the French and Raven's basis of power. As heard previously, Amazon micromanages its employees and sets stringent requirements for the employees to follow. The company uses its coercive power to fire workers who are not able to meet the packing rates set by them. While adopting such an approach might seem to effectively push employees to work harder from the perspective of the company, they were however met with resistance from workers, as many employees quit due to grueling work conditions. In conclusion, the difference between Amazon and TikTok's ethical practices arises from two main aspects. Firstly, there is a gap between the ethical values that the employees and the organization hold, which emphasizes the lack of communication of corporate values and mission across Amazon. On the other hand, TikTok's ethical values are seen to be largely consistent within the organization, which explains why they are considered to be more ethical. Overall, we believe that the ultimate goal of businesses are to maximize profits, and in the process of doing so, we acknowledge that certain trade-offs have to happen as organizations are always operating in the grey area. However, organizations also need to balance between its importance of earning profits and the responsibility and moral obligation to act ethically to its consumers.